Mark had been driving for 16 hours straight, eager to complete his delivery of construction materials to a site near Cheyenne. The route his GPS suggested was a shortcut, a 2-lane road known as Route 22, cutting through a dense forest and barren hills. The locals called it the Midnight Signal Highway, though no one could explain the name's origin. The night was ink black, and the moon was obscured by a thick layer of clouds. His truck's headlights carved out a narrow tunnel of visibility, illuminating the winding road ahead. Apart from the occasional rustling of trees in the wind and the distant howl of coyotes, the world around him was dead silent. Around 1:30 a.m., Mark felt the familiar tug of fatigue, so he switched on the truck's radio to break the monotony. Static crackled through the speakers. He twisted the dial, searching for a station, when suddenly, a chilling voice emerged from the static. "Keep driving. Don't stop. You're not alone." The voice was flat, robotic, and devoid of emotion. Startled, Mark glanced at the radio display, but it only showed random numbers that flickered and shifted. Something he'd never seen before. He quickly turned off the radio, brushing it off as interference or a prank. But the unease had set in. As Mark rounded a sharp curve, his headlights caught something up ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the road, waving one arm while clutching a bag with the other. Mark slowed down and squinted through the windshield. It was a woman, mid-30s, wearing a tattered hoodie and jeans. Her face was pale, her expression desperate. Against his better judgment, Mark pulled over. He cracked his window slightly and asked, "Are you okay? Need help?" "Please, I need a ride," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something out here." The urgency in her tone convinced Mark to let her in. She climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her bag tightly. Her hands were shaking. "What's your name?" Mark asked. "Claire," she replied, her eyes darting nervously at the road behind them. As Mark drove, Claire explained her situation. She claimed she'd been driving along Route 22 when her car broke down. She had called for help, but her phone's battery died before she could give her location. Left with no choice, she started walking. That's when she noticed strange things. A low, guttural sound in the woods, the feeling of being watched, and fleeting shadows that didn't belong to trees. Mark dismissed her story as the product of nerves, but he couldn't deny the tension in the air. He felt it too, a suffocating heaviness that seemed to grow stronger with each passing mile. Then Claire said something that made Mark's blood run cold. "Whatever you do, don't stop if you see her." "See who?" Mark asked. "The woman in white," Claire whispered. "She's not real." A few minutes later, they spotted something on the side of the road. A figure. As they got closer, Mark realized it was a woman dressed in a long white gown. Her back was turned to them, and her long black hair hung limply down her shoulders. Mark instinctively slowed the truck, but Claire grabbed his arm. "Don't stop," she hissed. "Keep driving." Confused but alarmed, Mark pressed the accelerator. As they passed the woman, Claire kept her eyes shut, muttering under her breath. Mark stole a glance in his side mirror, and his stomach dropped. The woman was now standing in the middle of the road, staring after them. Her face was pale and expressionless, her eyes two dark voids. For the next 10 minutes, the tension in the truck was unbearable. Claire remained silent, staring straight ahead, while Mark struggled to keep his hands steady on the wheel. Then, out of nowhere, the truck's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Mark muttered, his heart racing. The truck slowed to a crawl before coming to a complete stop. Mark tried the ignition, but the engine refused to turn over. The radio crackled to life, spewing garbled static and that same robotic voice. "She's here." Claire began to cry softly, clutching her bag like a lifeline. Mark's heart pounded as he scanned the road ahead. The woman in white was there again, standing just a few feet in front of the truck. This time, her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her lips were moving, though no sound came out. Mark grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck, ignoring Claire's frantic protests. As he approached the figure, his flashlight began to flicker, plunging him into near darkness. When the beam steadied, the woman was gone. Mark spun around, his breath clouding in the cold air. The road was empty. Back in the truck, Claire was visibly shaking. Mark demanded to know what was going on, but Claire remained silent, her eyes glued to her bag. "What's in there?" Mark asked. "It's her," Claire finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Mark could ask what she meant, the truck roared back to life. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, and to Mark's horror, the woman in white was now standing inches from the hood, her empty eyes staring directly at him. Mark slammed the accelerator, steering around the figure. The truck lurched forward, and the woman disappeared into the night. Claire began screaming, but Mark couldn't focus on her words. All he could think about was getting off that cursed road. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the main highway. The oppressive weight lifted, and the world seemed normal again. Mark pulled over at a truck stop, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. Claire climbed out without a word, leaving her bag behind. When Mark opened it, all he found was a small porcelain doll dressed in white. Mark never saw Claire again, and he avoided Route 22 for the rest of his career. He kept the doll locked in a toolbox, too afraid to throw it away. Every so often, he swears he hears faint whispers coming from the box, but he refuses to open it. To this day, Mark believes the woman in white wasn't just a ghost, she was a warning. And Claire? Perhaps she was part of the warning too. Jenna had been driving for hours through winding mountain roads when she spotted the entrance to Ridgeview Tunnel. It loomed before her like the mouth of a beast, wide and black, with moss-covered stone walls flanking either side. The tunnel was long enough to swallow her car whole, and even in daylight it seemed to emit darkness. A rusty sign hung askew nearby. "Danger. Enter at your own risk." Undeterred, Jenna parked her car by the roadside, grabbed her camera, Uwat, and began recording. The wind rustled through the surrounding trees, carrying with it a faint metallic smell that made her wrinkle her nose. As she approached the tunnel, the air grew colder, and the ambient sounds of the forest seemed to vanish. It was as if the world had been muted. Her camera captured the tunnel's gaping entrance and the graffiti scrawled on its walls. Most of it warnings like, "Don't go in," and "She waits." She chuckled nervously at the theatrics of previous visitors, but felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped inside. The first few steps were uneventful. The crunch of her boots on gravel echoed in the vast emptiness, and the flashlight she carried barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. The tunnel seemed endless, the walls curving slightly to obscure the exit behind her. Despite her earlier confidence, she felt a growing sense of unease. Halfway in, Jenna noticed strange markings on the wall. They weren't graffiti, but rather deep scratches, as if something with claws had gouged at the stone. Her flashlight beam wavered as her hands trembled. She paused to examine the marks more closely, her breath forming visible puffs in the icy air. That's when she heard it, a faint, echoing sob. It sounded like a woman crying, her voice distorted by the tunnel's acoustics. Jenna froze, every instinct telling her to run, but her curiosity got the better of her. She called out, her voice shaky, "Hello? Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly. Silence pressed down on her like a physical weight. Just as she was about to turn back, a voice replied, soft and broken, "Help me." The voice came from deeper within the tunnel. Against her better judgment, Jenna ventured further, her camera capturing every step. The air grew colder still, and the tunnel walls seemed to close in, the darkness growing heavier. Then her flashlight flickered. Panicking, she smacked it against her palm until the beam steadied, but the brief lapse had allowed the darkness to encroach. She strained her eyes, certain she saw movement up ahead. A shadow shifted, something large, humanoid, but wrong. It moved unnaturally, its limbs too long and its gait jerky, like a puppet on strings. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as the figure stopped and turned toward her. Its face was a blank, pale oval, devoid of features except for two deep black holes where eyes should have been. Her legs refused to move as the figure began to approach, its movements unnervingly slow, as if savoring her fear. The sobbing resumed, louder now, echoing from all directions. She realized with horror that the cries weren't coming from the figure. They were coming from the walls. Jenna snapped out of her paralysis and turned to flee, her camera swinging wildly as she sprinted toward the exit. The flashlight flickered again, and, for a heart-stopping moment, she was plunged into total darkness. She could hear the thing behind her now, its heavy, dragging steps growing faster. The tunnel seemed endless. Her lungs burned as she ran, the exit still a pinprick of light in the distance. The sobbing grew louder, morphing into anguished screams that seemed to vibrate through her skull. When Jenna finally burst out into the open air, she collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. She dared to look back, but the tunnel was empty. The screams had stopped, and the oppressive darkness seemed confined to the passageway. She scrambled to her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. Once inside, she locked the doors and sped away, not daring to look in her rearview mirror until she was miles away. Days later, Jenna reviewed the footage. Most of it was as she remembered. Her commentary, the scratches on the wall, the sobbing. But near the end, as she was running, the camera had captured something chilling. The figure was visible, just for a moment, standing at the tunnel's entrance, watching her. Its blank face filled the frame before the video abruptly cut to static. Jenna deleted the footage and vowed never to return to Ridgeview Tunnel. Despite her efforts to forget, she still dreams of the faceless figure, always standing at the edge of her vision, waiting. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Claire decided to visit Westbrook Manor for the first time. Armed with her camera and notebook, she set off on foot, the path to the manor winding through the dense woods that surrounded it. The air was thick with mist, and the trees seemed to loom ominously over her, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Every now and then, she would hear a twig snap underfoot, or the rustle of leaves, but no one was around. The village felt miles away, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The manor itself appeared out of the mist like a ghostly apparition. Its towering silhouette seemed to rise from the earth, the once grand windows now broken and boarded up. The iron gates at the entrance were rusted, and the grounds were overrun with weeds and unkempt hedges. Despite its derelict state, there was something unnervingly beautiful about the place, something that drew Claire in, even as every instinct told her to turn back. She pushed the gates open and walked cautiously toward the front door, which creaked eerily as she stepped onto the porch. The door, surprisingly, wasn't locked. It swung open with a force that startled her, and Claire hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. But her curiosity pushed her forward, and she stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight. The air in the manor was heavy, stale with years of neglect. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The once grand hall was now a cavern of silence, its opulence lost to time. Claire wandered through the dark, empty rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. Faded portraits lined the walls, their eyes seemingly following her every move. The further she ventured into the manor, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. As she reached the grand staircase, Claire noticed something unusual. A trail of fresh footprints in the dust. They were faint, as though someone had passed through recently, but she was certain no one lived here. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She had no choice but to follow the trail, her steps muffled in the silence. The trail led her to a door at the end of a long corridor. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Claire pushed the door open and stepped into the room. It was a study. The walls lined with bookshelves, and a large fireplace stood cold and empty in the center. But what caught her attention was the figure standing in front of the window. A man, tall and thin, with dark hair and a long black coat. His back was to her, and he stood motionless, staring out into the overgrown garden beyond. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had been sure she was alone, but the man didn't seem to acknowledge her presence. She called out softly, but he didn't respond. She took a hesitant step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, are you lost?" The man didn't turn, and Claire felt a chill creep up her spine. He was an odd sight, standing there like a figure from another time, out of place in the decaying manor. As she took another step toward him, the room seemed to grow colder, and the atmosphere thickened as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. Suddenly, the man turned, and Claire's heart skipped a beat. His face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. His lips barely moved as he spoke, his voice a raspy whisper. "Leave this place, before it's too late." Claire took a step back, her pulse racing. She was terrified, but couldn't bring herself to leave. Something in his gaze held her captive, and she found herself asking, "Who are you?" The man remained silent, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the dark hallway. Claire stood frozen, unable to move, unsure of whether she should follow him or flee. The silence in the room was suffocating, and every instinct told her to leave. But the mystery of the manor kept her rooted to the spot. She finally gathered enough courage to step outside the study, but when she turned to leave, the house seemed to shift. The hallway stretched longer than it had been, and the door she had entered through was no longer in sight. Panic surged through her as the walls seemed to warp, and the familiar layout of the manor became unrecognizable. As she stumbled through the house, Claire noticed something even more unsettling. The portraits on the walls had changed. No longer were they the faded images of long-dead ancestors. Now, they were portraits of the man she had just seen, his gaunt face staring out from every frame. It was as though the entire house had transformed into a twisted reflection of the man's presence. Desperate to escape, Claire raced toward the front door, but when she reached it, it was locked, and the entire manor seemed to groan and shift around her. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and a low, guttural voice whispered from the walls, "You should have left when you had the chance." Suddenly, the man appeared again at the top of the staircase. His eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, and his mouth twisted into a grim smile. He was not human. Not anymore. Claire's heart pounded as she sprinted toward the door, throwing herself against it with all her might. The door gave way, and she tumbled out into the overgrown garden. Gasping for air, Claire didn't stop running until she reached the village. She never returned to Westbrook Manor, and no one ever heard from her again. Her disappearance was yet another chapter in the long, dark history of the manor, a place where no one could escape its silent, haunting grip. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.